companions, Manjolo and I left our camp after we found the signs of the poachers, and we headed southwestwards, away from the Luyana River and from those villages that Manjolo thought existed on the north side of the river. Now, the bush was as beautiful as ever. There were no roads. We had to find lanes through the trees and in areas break a little bit of bush to get going, but we made reasonable progress southeastwards. Driving through that bush like that takes a lot of concentration because one has to not only find a way but also try and protect the vehicle. But one nevertheless has time to think, and I thought I'd elaborate a little bit more on the issue of poaching in the wilderness of Africa. Now, I think all of us will agree that poaching should be abhorred for various reasons. It's first of all, it's against the law. Secondly, one has conservation concerns. And thirdly, poachers kill animals in very cruel ways. Animals that are caught in snares and traps take a long time to die. Often they break free and they get away, but they are maimed for life and they sometimes die afterwards of shock or incapacity. But I have to say that I have come over many poachers and signs of poachers in the wilderness. It's part of the African wilderness. This is an example of two protein poachers. They are semi-nomads and they live off the bush, and they're on their way to go and check their snares and to see if they can't get any fish caught in a fake. That's their way of life, has always been their way of life. And this is a typical poacher's camp. There were 4 of them. You can see the grass beds they had made for themselves, and they had slept between fires. They had made fires between them as protection against predators, and they had placed logs on either side of their beds to prevent them from rolling into the fire in their sleep. Now, these guys were either a small hunting pack or a rather large group of protein hunters that had moved a bit further away, but I think probably a small hunting pack. Their fires were still slightly warm, so they'd left that morning early. We think they had become aware of us. I had my brother with me at the time, so we had 2 guns and 2 other men from the bush, and they were armed with machetes and axes and so on. So I think they thought they were a little bit outnumbered, and it's best if they rather take their leave. African people have lived off the land, off the bush, for generations, and they have harvested meat from the bush. So these laws and regulations and promulgations that are made in some capital somewhere that they don't even quite know where it is, mean very little to these people living in their little bush villages, isolated by days of walking, and even living semi-nomadically in little family groups in the bush. So they carry on with their lives. And I thought maybe I could share 1 or 2 stories about what I saw with you while we're on the subject of poaching. So, on the one occasion, I was wandering around in the wilderness, and I had with me a guy called Elias. Now, Elias was born in the bush and had lived his whole life there. He was an excellent bushman. Now Elias could not, of course, speak any language that I could. We had to communicate through a guy that I had with me that could translate, or through sign language. But I had sent the translator back to a temporary camp I had made along the way, to which we had carried supplies, to go and get us some more supplies. So Elias and I were wandering around alone. I noticed a chop mark on a tree close to us. A mark made by a human. And when I went to the tree to investigate, I could see that it's maybe 2 or 3 days old. And I looked around and I saw another mark, maybe 30 meters away. I wondered where these marks came from. We were at least 5 or 6 days walking away from the nearest human habitation that anybody that I was with knew about. So I said to Elias in the best way that I could, let's follow the marks to see where they go. But he shook his head very vigorously. But I was still interested, and I started following these chop marks. It was fairly easy. You had to look very carefully to see the next mark, but I could find it. And we followed these marks. But Elias, although he usually led the way, he now tagged behind. And every time I looked back at him, he would shake his head very disapproving. But we carried on like this, and eventually we came to a big baobab tree. And there were signs of human presence there. Sleeping mats were lying around, eating utensils. There were skins hanging over poles and wires. Some skins were spread on the ground. Lots of meat hanging in strings and strips. And there were 3 men there. And they hadn't noticed us initially. They were sitting around a little wood fire, and they were frying some meat. And we actually smelled the meat before we got even close to the baobab tree. When they saw us, they jumped up and they almost ran away, but then the one guy, who seemed quite aggressive, stood, and the others remained too. Now, we greeted them. They were very surly, and Elias started chatting to them, and I now realized that this was a poacher's den, and we had walked right into this poacher's den. And this was a dangerous situation. Now, I had a rifle with me at that time, and I moved back towards the baobab tree so that I could have it against my back. And there were also 3 weapons there. There was a machete or 2. There were 2 guns. One was a muzzleloader and the other was a homemade pipe gun. Both, of course, lethal, especially at close range. Now, Elias was chatting to these guys, and I could see that they were not getting along at all. So I attracted Elias's attention, and I indicated that we should go. Now, I cocked my rifle, or at least I opened the breech and kind of made as if I was checking whether there was a round in the chamber. And I closed the breech and I slipped on the safety catch very purposefully and looked at these guys in a meaningful way to try and discourage any sort of act from them. But I realized they were only 3, and they were a little bit intimidated by me and Elias and me being armed and them not being, until they got to their guns. I knew that if their companions returned, we might be in very serious trouble. These guys all knew that they were well beyond the reach of any kind of law. And my gun was a prized possession. And they were very prone to killing us, taking it, backtracking us to where our camp was and taking whatever we had there. So we had to get away as cleanly as possible. We walked away, and I checked back every now and again to see whether they were following. And then I started applying anti-tracking, and we moved away at least 2 or 3 kilometers in an easterly direction. And then I had us turn 90 degrees south, but I had Elias cut back to see if they weren't possibly following us. And he came back after about half an hour and said no, they were not. So we then carried on south and then made another 90-degree turn and walked to our camp. We only got to our camp when it was well past dark. I was fairly sure that at least for that night they would not be trying to find us. But as was the case always with poachers, one has to be very careful. And I hope this gives you some idea of the situation in the wilderness with poachers. And I hope you enjoyed this little story, and that you will join me next time. Good luck until then.